I am the nature hacker, and this is your world. So I have a lot of orders to fulfill, but I just gotta get this info out there. I know exactly how a battery works, and it is not what they are telling us. So it's time to forget everything you think you know about how batteries work. And also check out my website, naturehackerproducts.com. I just released an article about basically how capacitors work, which is they're basically two-step batteries, okay, is what capacitors are. I like it. I like the way capacitors are. They're basically fully reserved batteries, batteries that do not they don't self-discharge, I guess is one way to say it. You know, capacitors do obviously self-discharge, but it's almost as if they don't, because they are only activated when you charge them. So it's like they aren't getting used up when they're not charged, let's put it that way. They're good, like, you know, just things to have for a rainy day. You know, you have a capacitor, it's never going to go bad, okay? But anyway, read that article on naturehackerproducts.com. It's like tantalum. Like, if you can't find it, go to the right-hand side of my website. In the search bar, type in tantalum, Tantalum, and you'll find that article. But anyway, so how do batteries work? Well, you know what, I really don't want to go into how they say they work, because that would just be too confusing. So I just want to stay focused on how they actually work. So just clear your mind. Batteries. What do you think of it when you think of a battery? Get rid of that. Okay. Now all we have is two plates and an electrolyte between it. Okay, that's it. That's a battery. Everything else you think you know about a battery, forget it. Okay. Now those two plates. In a battery, they have to be different metals, okay? In a battery, they have to be different metals. In a capacitor, they can be the same. But in a battery, they have to be different metals or different compounds. You know, a lot of times they'll use non-metal compounds like lead sulfate. Just really stupid. But in the real world, in the nature hacker world, electrodes are only made out of metal, okay? And so we have two metals and an electrolyte between them. That is the battery. That's it. That's all she wrote. That's what a battery is, okay? Now, one of those metals on the two sides, one of them has to be different than the other. They have to be two different metals. Now, that is what we've got. So we have these two different metals, okay? And now we have an electrolyte. Now, this electrolyte has to be able to oxidize one of the, just, you know, ideally it would just be barely able to oxidize one of those metals while it's just standing there, okay? So it would just barely. Let's say that it's like at the exact line to where it's like, you know, I don't want to give you oxidation reduction potentials, but I will, just for people who know oxidation reduction potentials. Let's say the electrolyte's oxidation potential is 0.66 volts, and the anode's reduction potential is 0.66 volts. That would be perfect. You want the electrolyte to be just as oxidizing as the metal is reducing, okay? So that way it's like just barely, almost not working, but kind of is working. Like it's just right on the boundary, okay? So you want the electrolyte to be just barely able to oxidize the one of the metals, and you do not want it to be able to oxidize the other metal, okay? You want it to be not able to oxidize the other metal at all, ideally, okay? And you want it to just barely be able to oxidize that anode, is what it is, the anode. And which is basically, it's a sacrificial anode. It's what the battery eats up. It eats up the anode. The electrolyte eats up the anode. Okay, now when the electrolyte eats up the anode, it's oxidizing the metal atoms at the anode. They're getting oxidized. Okay, now the electrolyte oxidizes it, and then those things become soluble, and you know the atoms flow out into the electrolyte. You know, so if you have a gold electrode, the electrolyte oxidizes the gold into, like, let's say gold chloride, you know, and then you have a gold chloride electrolyte. You know, so it's breaking down the anode and it's solubilizing it in your electrolyte. So that is how it's working. Now, as those atoms get oxidized, they lose electrons up to the rest of the anode. So, the negative the negative electrolytes go and attach to the positive gold atom, and the positive gold atom is like, wait, I have an extra electron. The electrolyte is trying to give it an electron, and it already has an extra electron binded, using that to bind it to the other gold atoms on the anode. So then it's like, wait, let me give up my extra electron that's binding me. So it gives up that electron. That electron goes up the anode, and that's where you have your negative. That's your negative terminal in a battery, is your anode. So it's like, wait, let me give up my electron so I can go and swim with you in the electrolyte. So that's what it does. It gives up its electrons and swims in the electrolyte. So that's what happens. That's how we create energy in a battery, is that when the anode is being broken down, it releases electrons back up the anode, and that's how we get our electrons, and hence electricity. So that is what is happening. And now all the cathode has to do is just be not oxidized. If the anode is getting oxidized, the cathode just has to be like, just has to stay safe, just like, wait, I'm not going to do anything. And just as long as it doesn't do anything, it doesn't get oxidized by the electrolyte, then we get electrical current, because the cathode that doesn't react is just going to be neutral, right? And then the anode is going to be negative. So neutral to negative, it's, neutral is relatively positive to the negative. So that's your positive electrode, is that neutral electrode. So that's what you've got. Now, why do I say just barely be able to oxidize? The electrolyte should just barely be able to oxidize the anode. And the reason is because if it's oxidizing it really well, I mean, your battery is just going to discharge. It's just going to tank. Even when you're not doing anything, your battery is just going to just tank, because the anode is just getting oxidized, and it's pretty bad. So how do we make it so that it only gives us electricity when we want it, when we're actually hooking it up to something and trying to pull electricity out of it, right? How do we do that? Well, we do that by making the electrolyte just barely be able to oxidize it on its own. So then what happens is when we hook it up, what happens when we hook a battery up to something? I mean, what's the most simplest case? Hooking a battery up to a wire, right? That's the simplest case. You got the anode hooked up to the cathode. That's the simplest circuit, okay? It's a battery hooked up to itself with a wire, okay? Now, everything else can be modeled as a battery hooked up to a resistor and then hooked to the other side of the battery, okay? So in any case, electrons are going to flow from the anode that we oxidize, and as we oxidize the anode, it releases electrons, right? Those electrons go up through the resistor or through the wire or whatever, come back to the positive side, okay? Now, so as we know, the cathode was the reduced side, the side that was not being oxidized, right? So if we're throwing more electrons to it, we're giving it more electrons. Electrons reduce. Electrons are antioxidants, okay? They counteract oxidation. So we're giving the cathode more electrons. So we're making it even harder to oxidize it. We're making it even more, antioxidated, okay? So what's happening is that is going to drive, so if that side is even more antioxidative, that's going to drive the oxidation of the other side even faster, even harder. So as more current flows to the cathode, that makes more oxidation happen at the anode. It's charging it, it's polarizing it. It's doing what it's really doing is more of a capacitor type effect, but that's what's happening. So that's why you want your electrolyte to not quite dissolve the anode on its own. You want to wait, till there's actually a load attached to it, so that it can oxidize the anode. So it charges it, it polarizes it enough to where it wants to attack the anode. They think, well, couldn't they just flow through the electrolyte? Why do they have to go around? Well, the reason is because the electron direction, it's going up the anode and out, okay? That's where the electron direction is going. It's not flowing through the electrolyte, it's going this way. So then you have to connect this side back over to the other side, okay, to actually get the electrons to go into this side. So that's why if you short out a battery, it's going to get hot and like almost explode, is because you short out the battery with no load on it, with no resistor on it, it's going to make this side so negative, it's going to be a runaway reaction. It's a positive feedback loop. It's going to make this side so negative, or so reduced. I mean, you can't say positive or negative, okay? But this side's so reduced that the other side is going to get so oxidized that it's just going to run away and just explode or just go crazy. So that is how a battery works. Now you know how a battery works. You can design a battery. All you need to design a battery is two metals and an electrolyte. Two metals and an electrolyte. That's it. And if you know that, hey, I want that electrolyte to just be barely able to oxidize the anode on its own, maybe even not able to, right? So that when I hook it up, then it will go faster, So it's like the more the more connection you get between the anode and cathode, the more it will attack, the electrolyte will attack the anode and create more power. So that's why when you hook up a battery, it uses up the battery faster than just the battery sitting there. But if you have too strong of an electrolyte, then it will just discharge on its own without even applying a load to it. So that is how a battery works, and I mean that's really it. I mean, and then the only thing you need to know to design a battery is you need to be able to read an oxidation reduction potential table. And if you just type in, and I will link it actually in the description. I'm going to link to the best oxidation reduction table, the best, the most total complete oxidation reduction potential possible. So I'm going to link to that. What you do is you go there and you want to look, okay, you want to look, I mean, in a noble metal battery, which, you can look at my other YouTube videos for noble metal battery, and it's on my website, but for a noble metal battery, you want a, let's say you're picking silver. Silver is what I am going to use, okay? So silver has a oxidation potential of basically 0.8, okay? So if I want to use silver as my anode, which I do, I want an electrolyte that can oxidize with 0.8. So I want to look on that table and find an oxidation reaction, which is, I think it's going to be in the negative side, isn't it? It's going to be either negative or positive, I can't remember, but you're going to want to look for a reaction, an oxidation reaction that's also 0.8. So that would be your electrolyte, would be 0.8. And then for the cathode, you want a metal that's just impenetrable to that electrolyte. So you want, let me just give you some hints, the vanadium area on the periodic table, like tungsten and niobium and tantalum. Tantalum is the top one. Those are all really resistant. So you can, if you want to use tantalum, you can easily put that in there as a cathode, and it's not going to be affected at all by the electrolyte. So that's all you need. You need one metal that's not affected by the electrolyte. You want another metal that can be oxidized, and you want an electrolyte that can just barely oxidize that anode. So that's all you need. Okay, so that is how a battery works. Forget everything else that you thought you knew, that you were taught that was wrong. This is how a battery works. Use this information to change the world. I am the Nature Hacker. Do work.